Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar. I am Matt Godfrey, the Deputy Head of Downe House, where we hosted a wonderful conference yesterday. And this webinar has been sent to all of our delegates and is being produced in partnership with Keystone Tutors and Simply Learning as well, two very well-established and reputable tutoring companies that were very kind to sponsor our conference on Wednesday yesterday. So this webinar is going to be focusing on how schools and tutoring organisations such as Simply Learning and Keystone can collaborate effectively. And here at Downe House, we have had experience working with Keystone on a number of projects, but also on this webinar, we have two other senior teachers. We have Max Gayler, the head teacher of the Kennet School, and Nicola Grant-Stevenson from Maida Vale School, who will introduce themselves in a moment, but they're going to be giving their experience and their ideas on this topic as well. So I think we'll crack on with a question. As chair of this webinar, I'll be asking the questions, but hope to contribute myself. Nicola, I think I'll come to you first, if I may. The question firstly is, what challenge or opportunity first led your school, Maida Vale, to work with a tutoring organisation? And how has your thinking about these partnerships evolved since then?
Thank you. So I'm Nicola Grant-Stevenson. I'm the SENCo safeguarding lead and pastoral lead at Maida Vale School in West London. So we're a fairly small, fairly new independent secondary school. We first used a tutoring agency when we had a member of our teaching staff leave the school partway through the academic year. And we sourced an excellent replacement, but that person couldn't start with us until the beginning of the next academic year. We really wanted to take that person on board. So we got involved with the tutoring agency first in terms of looking for someone to fill that gap for a term for us. We didn't want to go down the traditional supply teacher route, so reached out to an agency, and that was really successful. And in terms of, I think, how our thinking and our use of tutoring agencies has developed since then has really been about exploring lots of different ways that a tutoring agency can work with us once that initial relationship has been built. Because I think we'll probably come on to that later, but I think building a relationship with a particular agency is really helpful in terms of onboarding tutors, the induction process, and making it a really successful partnership rather than just a transaction.
Great, thank you very much, Nicola. And perhaps Max, could you introduce yourself and give us your experience in this respect?
Of course, yeah, thanks, Matt. So my name is Max Gayler. I'm currently acting head teacher of the Kennet School in Thatcham, which is a state school of nearly 2,000 pupils, having previously held the role of both the pastoral and academic deputy positions. We first became engaged with a tutoring company because we needed a deep contextual understanding of an A-level subject. Again, in response to, in the first engagement, in response to an unforeseen staffing issue, where we needed quality and reliability, and we needed that quickly. I think it's fair to say there's a range of tutoring companies, but I think through reputation and picking up various conversations with colleagues in the education sector, I think that risk was reduced because of Keystone's ongoing staff development. And that's really what led us to engage beyond the traditional routes of a supply teacher or supply teaching agency.
Right, thank you. And I should perhaps explain one experience we've had at Downe House, whereby we wanted to provide an enrichment course based on law. We have quite a few sixth formers who are interested in either studying law at university or maybe becoming lawyers, and we didn't have expertise in our school for that. So that is why we partnered with Keystone to put in a law elective, which was an optional course for sixth formers who are interested in either of those things, and that's proved to be successful and popular. So that's great. Thank you to Max and Nicola. And next question is, what makes a school tutoring partnership genuinely strategic rather than purely transactional? A little bit more about how you plan and how you work with such an agency. So, Nicola, could I come to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think you really need to think about the long-term outcomes that you're hoping for. That can be for the school as a whole, as it was with our first introduction to a tutoring agency. What do we want to achieve at the end of this? Where do we need to be? But it can be for individual pupils and families as well, which is other ways that we have worked with tutoring agencies. So I think thinking about the end point and working back from that before you begin the process is what allows you to be strategic, because otherwise it does become a sort of an everyday, day-to-day transaction. But if you're thinking in the longer term, then you have to think about who is the person that we need, or what skills do they need to have? How frequently will they be working with us? Who will be their link person in the school? What kind of information sharing will we be going through? What kinds of induction processes will both sides need? So I think thinking long term rather than, and going back to what Max said about not using the traditional supply teacher route, I think sometimes that route just becomes a day-to-day transaction. You're not necessarily having the same person every day. You're not having that degree of flexibility, that degree of input into what you need. So I think using an agency where it's much more negotiated, I would say, is what allows it to be more strategic.
Thank you. And Max, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I think it's about shifting that short-term arrangement, perhaps to an unforeseen staffing issue, to a relationship that's really built on partnership. And I think then it moves beyond the short-term transaction. I think in the current climate, we need to find that way to be collaborative and to plan in advance, and for us to look at things across trust budgets, not just the school budget. And not constraining our thinking to those traditional supply routes or traditional solutions that tend to be fairly reactive. So when you have a relationship and a partnership, it's about engaging with that agency to explore what they have on offer, whether, as you said, Matt, to engage with the elective program, to enrich your co-curricular offer, or find bespoke solutions to increase your A-level offer. Whether that's, for us, we engage with the pro bono program to support our really able disadvantaged pupils to gain competitive places at Oxford universities. So I think it's shifting from a short-term transactional relationship to a partnership where it moves from that operational day-to-day to strategically planned solutions in partnership with an agency.
And I imagine that it's been both of your experiences by moving away from the traditional sort of mode of bringing in cover teachers with a tutoring agency, or from the pupil's point of view, it's a better deal because they're getting the same person and more consistency in the approach. Would you both say that?
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say also that the depth of experience and knowledge that longer term tutors have brought to us is definitely of a different standard to most of the supply cover teachers that we've worked with.
So Nicola, could I ask you on this topic, do you obviously have sometimes needed intervention to save a staffing situation, but what about enrichment or using this kind of tutoring for non-standard curriculum delivery? Do you do that in your school?
Yeah, so we've also used a tutoring agency for English as an additional language provision, because that was just a skill set that we didn't have available to us in the school. As I said in my introduction, we're quite a small school and quite a new school. So it's been really helpful for us to be able to bring in that level of experience of things where we don't yet have capacity for ourselves.
Yeah, particularly as a growing school, I suppose. Yeah, and similarly, Max, have you got other examples of things you either have done or are thinking of doing?
Yeah, well, I think in that bespoke individual support for our disadvantaged pupils, it gives them that tailored support to realise success in their Oxbridge applications. That not to say that we don't have the expertise, but that frees up the expertise and the time of the staff here to focus more broadly across our sixth form, but at the same time of giving that individualised personal response. And I think that's the difference between, education is primarily a relational activity. So that continuity with an agency means that frequency of contact plays a part to build the relationship with that student and the tutor over time. And then it goes beyond just the transactional knowledge of the curriculum. It's then about study skills and habits and relationships, which makes it more powerful.
Great. Well, certainly on this topic and the topics to come, I should mention now that we have Ed Richardson from Keystone Tutors and Nathaniel McCullagh from Simply Learning on the call too. So at this point, would either one of you like to contribute now to the discussion?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think these are all really good points, and I think the word I'd sort of use to perhaps coalesce is optimization in some ways. So with bringing in a tutoring company on a planned basis, you're actually able to quite a sort of micro level pinpoint for individual students what's really going to help them. So as well as covering, so we've for example, the more standard filling in for a teacher for a period of months is quite commonplace. A-levels, GCSE, that's planned. And what's nice is the tutor can be, to a degree, hand-picked, but they're also managed quite carefully by the agency or by the company. So you've got as a school, you've always got a client manager to speak to whose pedagogical knowledge is really strong, who understands safeguarding and schools and modes of working really clearly. But you're actually able to look at small groups and create, you kind of replicate the house experience where you can put people into little groups depending on their ability and triage and give them specific, possibly holiday revision groups, which I think could be challenging to do with permanent staff because they're on holiday. You can bring in a tutoring group to actually really focus on a particular weakness that maybe a certain group has got and work at a different level with another group. So you can really target your teaching and your catch up. And I think that is a nice way of hopefully improving grades across the board, whilst not really interfering with the day-to-day teaching.
Thank you. And Ed, would you like to add anything at this point?
No, I would just like to reference the fact that obviously what Max and Nicola have said is that it speaks to a really broad church of aspects and areas that schools might be looking for support on, both support and extension. And isn't it great that there is an industry out there that has got a lot of really well experienced practitioners who are professionally minded and operating such that they can come in and complement the work of schools. I think that's an important word. We're complementing the work of schools. We're not trying to undo it. We're working alongside them, and we're very much taking their instruction. And so I think there are lots of opportunities in this area. So it's reactive, yes, in a lot of the ways in which we start with schools. It's reacting to a particular problem. But as Nicola and Max have spoken to, those tend to transition into longer term relationships where at the very least they come to us going, we've got this thinking, or we're thinking about this, how is it that you might be able to support us in affecting this? They sort of look at the outcome first, as Nicola spoke to, and then working back from that, what's the best way of achieving this? And having worked in schools myself, I understand the way in which this sort of thinking traditionally would have been solved probably through things like supply or perhaps internally by resourcing that by your expertise that you might have in house. But the problem is that schools have got more and more things to do, less and less time, and arguably perhaps less and less people, or fewer people to do those things. So I think trying to work in collaboration with others, including tutoring companies, I think gives schools an opportunity, and I think it's worth exploring it, whether or not they decide that for this particular initiative they're going to do it or not. I think it's a genuine opportunity, and it's viable nowadays, much more so than it's ever been, I think.
Excellent, thank you. If I maybe go back to Nicola for this next question. So I think a lot of people traditionally think as tutors as a kind of bolt-on. That's certainly maybe an old-fashioned mode, and we've already heard how this approach is different to that. But I just wonder, Nicola, whether you can talk us through how schools actually enable tutors, if you're using a tutor, to become a genuine extension of the pastoral and academic support around a student rather than seemingly being a bolt-on or separate sort of external thing? What can you do as a school to make it all seem like a cohesive approach from the pupil's point of view?
I think that begins right at the start with developing the partnership with an agency or a group, in that you don't need to explain your school's context every time you're reaching out to look for support. And that means they can guide you towards tutors that they know will be a good fit for your school. Every school is different. Every school has a different ethos. And a square peg doesn't always fit the round hole. So I think beginning with that understanding of what the school is generally allows the relationship with the agency and therefore the tutors to become more organic and more holistic. I think also working with an agency on a close basis like this means that whoever is coming to you, you have the time and the capacity to do that proper induction rather than a supply teacher, just turning up on day one with their briefcase and walking into the classroom. So you can build those relationships beforehand. You can give the context of the pupils. You can talk through any safeguarding issues. And when you have a longer term tutoring colleague as well, then they become part of the common room, and they're sharing their day-to-day experiences. We're trying to include them with our social events and our staff events, and make sure that they come to lunch with us and kind of genuinely treat them as a proper colleague, rather than with our supply teacher, they might be gone tomorrow.
Excellent, thank you. And Max, did you want to add to that?
I think just to expand on my answer about education being a relational activity and building that, the frequency of contact builds that relationship over time. I think it's also worth noting that there's more of an acceptance with parents and students about online provision and about the place that online provision can play within education, whether that be within the school day or through a co-curricular offer. I think that's what shifted the kind of traditional solutions, shifted us away from those traditional solutions to look at engaging with companies that can operate online, and ones where we can form that relationship. I guess there's quite a bit of work for us to do in terms of quality, in terms of value for money, and I think that's really where those conversations go from that initial reactive, unforeseen staffing issue. That builds over time, and I think the conversations with colleagues, throughout the education sector, help to mitigate that risk of quality. And I think those case studies help you in choosing the right company to engage with.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yes, you touched on that just now, but I was going to next just ask about quality assurance, because I'm sure colleagues in other schools would like to know, if you're going to use a tutoring agency, what builds trust with an agency and this kind of partnership, and how can schools evaluate whether the tutoring organisation is genuinely effective? Perhaps Max, could you comment on that?
Yes, I think that fact finding is key. I guess we have experience, from some relatively cheap providers to some that are substantially more, but I think you do pay for what you get, and I think it's important to work with agencies that support their staff to develop as professionals, and that you are reassured of the ongoing staff development of professional tutors, and I think that is quite a key distinction. The kind of experience of other colleagues, the personal recommendations, those things are really powerful, and we rely on those a lot. But that feeds into the feedback from parents and pupils, encourages you hopefully to engage a little bit more, and then start to explore some of the other offers.
Very good. Thank you, Ed and Nathaniel. Did you want to add anything at this stage?
Yeah, Ed, do you want to?
No, I just want to talk about, I think, what schools can do, less about, obviously our processes and practices. I think, we've seen schools perform learning walks online, jumping in and out of sessions quite comfortably. And I think that's a lot less distracting than potentially in person, particularly in groups, because they're not necessarily always seen. They can sort of appear and go back. And obviously we use our tutors, Nathaniel's tutors, will use things like online whiteboards, and so you can very quickly see and get a sense of what's going on in a class, the levels of interaction that are taking place. Obviously, the other thing I think would be really important, worth noting, is schools also use individual tutors. So it's worth noting that schools will go and resource local tutors, and have done for a long time in certain areas, particularly I'm thinking things like niche languages, etc. I guess the benefit of using a Simply Learning or a Keystone or another agency that does a similar sort of thing is that I guess when you have an issue with a particular tutor, or a tutor isn't there for some reason, or something's gone wrong potentially, you've got a whole resource behind them. Nathaniel spoke to this idea of a client manager, a single point of contact that schools can speak to around that. Nicola's spoken about the importance of this onboarding process. Clearly, safeguarding is pretty critical, and therefore we've got to think about, how is it that we present all the information that a school needs, such that they can be compliant on their side with bringing an external resource in for a positive, proactive reason, or just simply for a supportive, reactive reason, irrespective of those two things. So I think it's worth just thinking about those things. I think ultimately tutors can form. Tutoring is a big term, and I think it's very broadly defined. I guess what we're speaking to here, and what Nathaniel and I have experience of, is being an organisation and providing, as an organisation, support into schools, whether that's reactive or proactive. I think that's very different because you're dealing with the organisation and you're building a strategic partnership with the organisation. Some of the tutors absolutely do build these kind of really strong bonds and relations with the schools and the colleagues they work in. But ultimately, what they become is an extension of that school's teaching body. We would want our tutors to be operating under the same policies, the same guidance as all of your colleagues that do within school. And I think ultimately, good onboarding ensures that they do that. And so I think it's just worth understanding on the quality side. Ultimately, that's absolutely the benchmark of what we're looking to deliver on. We want to make sure that our tutors meet your expectations. That's absolutely the game that Nathaniel and I are in, and that's absolutely paramount at all times. And that's on a lesson by lesson basis as well. So it's a really important point. But schools do a range of different things, as I said, from learning walks, canvassing, obviously clearly the stakeholders, the students, the parents, etc. But it's pretty extensive nowadays, and I think the view of tutoring, which often I think in the past has not always had the most positive view, I think the reality now is that's very different now. You can get really strong operators, both at a tutor level but at an organisational level, who are meeting pedagogical, safeguarding, quality assurance standards, such that I think schools, as Max's point, can mitigate a lot of that risk around the concern of bringing in a provider of that type.
I think the trust is really key, as Ed suggests. We find that when a tutor is placed into a school long term, we start getting calls from the school saying, great, can they also work with this student or this group? So as Nicola says, the tutor becomes part of the school body, albeit they're only there 10 hours a week, but they become almost an extension. And I think what's a really useful development for this relationship in general is if, as Ed says, schools consider companies rather than individual tutors, because then you have a certainty of service and a touch point and a huge amount of responsibility. So one clear differential is, how is that tutor engaged? If a school doesn't employ them, someone should. So it's, in Keystone's case, they, I think, be very much employed. Employment business is another thing to look for. Employment agency is quite a big red flag, because there's no link between the school and the company. It's the school and the tutor individually, and they can be presented on lovely glossy websites and have fantastic abilities and be great teachers. But I think that's a very big difference in terms of accountability. And as Nicola, you mentioned also earlier, the continued training is really important. So just because they're a tutor, I mean, most of our tutors that work in schools are qualified teachers in any case, but that doesn't mean that without input from us, they wouldn't be receiving CPD. And it's important that they're up to speed with guidelines on AI, developments in safeguarding, just so they feel, I think, as well as knowing the material, but they feel confident when they're with colleagues in school, to be able to hold their heads up and say, yeah, actually, we come from an organisation that makes sure we're up to this job, and not just flying by the seat of their pants to get into the work. So I think it does come down to trust, but hopefully as these relationships evolve, the trust will become more sort of a given, and it can be taken as a these are responsible companies who care very deeply about the outcomes and track and follow up and are on the end of the phone whenever they're needed. And that would be lovely to see that become more, I think, more widespread, because it seems that particularly in the current climate, economic climate, schools really do need to pull in everything they can to give their students the best possible service, as it were, and the best possible outcomes. With the the big increase in diagnosis of SEND, tutors or teachers who are working with schools, I think it's really important that they have a big awareness of this. It just seems to be more prevalent. I don't know, Nicola, your position in schools specifically, but Max, have you seen this, that teachers who have an awareness of working with children with a wide range of SEND have an added value beyond their qualifications for that subject? And I think that's something that we really strive to deliver to schools, is an appropriate tutor. So if we're given a brief saying this class has got 2 or 3 students with SEN needs and describe them to us, we can then fit the job around the right person.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. And I'm mindful of time, just last few minutes, really. We did hopefully have time for a couple of other quick questions. One is, I think we've touched on some of this, but particularly Nicola and Max, whether you'd like to share any further specific examples where working with a tutoring agency allowed you to provide something, a service, or that otherwise you may not have been able to do, whether it be academic, pastoral, or operational. I'll just once again say one thing we did in the school, and it's perhaps worth mentioning that we are a boarding school. As I said before, we felt that our students wanted to know more about law as a potential undergraduate degree, but also as a profession. We didn't have the expertise on the ground, so we engaged with an agency which was able to provide a series of online sessions to cover a whole range of aspects of law. And actually our pupils were able to engage with those, to join those tutoring, those tutorials from their own dorms during the course of the day. So there was a convenient time when the class came together, each in their individual locations online, for a series of 6 one-hour tutorials. There was a cost associated with that, which was once split amongst that group of students. I think one year we had 12 students doing it. So when the cost was divided up, it was passed on to the parents, but it was relatively good value, considering that they were getting 6 hours of tuition, and it was quite a good deal, we felt. So that's my example. I don't know if any of you would like to share any others, Max or Nicola.
Yeah. I've got 2 examples actually of where we've used tutoring agencies really effectively. One to do with long-term ill health. So obviously when a pupil is ill, you set work. But when that becomes longer term, again, you've got to think about those long-term outcomes and what you want them to be. And a child working from home or working from hospital by themselves is not ideal. So if you can work in partnership with a tutor to make sure that there's also some in-person input, that makes both the outcomes for the pupil in terms of their education while they're unwell better, but also means the reintegration is likely to be more effective because the pupil is more up to speed, in a better place to reintegrate. And also there's someone there to support that reintegration process. And the other specific example that I would speak to is in the sphere of SEND, sometimes needs develop as a child moves through the school, and sometimes you realize that, your setting is not the right setting for them, or you can't support all of their needs effectively. And I think, we've used a tutoring agency to support a child where we couldn't meet their needs while they were in search of a school that could, because the worst thing you can do is pull the rug from under a pupil like that and just say, we can't meet your needs, so tough. we would never do that. So again, working with a tutoring agency to be able to fill that gap and support the pupils' education while they look for another placement, I think has been really powerful.
Thank you, Nicola. Max, did you want to add any other example from your experience?
I think I've mentioned, that reactive, A-level expertise to expanding the curriculum offer at A-level through the elective program, and the pro bono support, as I've already mentioned, are tangible examples of where we've engaged. But should you have a question, I think it's important to pick up the phone and to seek those. Just seek the dialogues and start to engage in the discussion. The recommendations from colleagues across the sector, the case studies are a great place to start, I think.
Yeah, great. May I just finish with this question, perhaps back to you, Max, which is one piece of advice for a head teacher listening to this webinar who's considering working more closely with a tutoring organisation. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is you have to pursue quality. We're a successful school, so parents and pupils and students have they're used to a very strong offer, and I think there can be a range out there across agencies, which is why it's important to seek reassurance from colleagues that have engaged elsewhere, review case studies on the website, and do your own due diligence within that process of appointing an agency. Be reassured about what the professional development opportunities are for tutors, how they're supported in CPD, to ensure that the what is being offered aligns with the standard that's acceptable for your school. I think the bespoke arrangements, the flexibility is really where it makes sense, and where you're able to plan with that across, in our case, across trust budgets. I think it's important to have those conversations as early as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nicola, a final word.
Yeah, I would echo what Max has said. Speak to your network. There are plenty of us who are using tutoring agencies really successfully, and even if we're not making a direct recommendation about a particular group to use, we can talk through what went well, what we might do differently the next time. So yeah, do reach out and ask.
Yes, and likewise for me too. Well, thank you to everyone who's contributed to this webinar. Ed and Nathaniel, is there anything else you'd like to say by way of wrapping this up?
Just to echo the points from the last question, there is absolutely no harm in just picking up the phone and organising a meeting or a video call to have a chat about what could be a strategic win for a school, where the need may be, or where it is, and just to build a relationship. Where Keystone Simply Learning are always really happy to just visit schools. We visit schools for a living, it's what we do, and to have a discussion about where there may be room to really help at key points. We're always very open to it.
Thank you. And Ed, on mute, Ed.
I think all of it's been covered, and I would just encourage people to start the dialogue, as everybody said. There are lots of people in the tutoring space now that are highly experienced at working with schools, and I think it's important that schools recognise that as a potential avenue to explore, to both support and enhance their offering.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Ed, Max, Nicola and Nathaniel. Thank you to Keystone Tutors and Simply Learning for being on this webinar, but also for generously sponsoring our conference. And I hope this webinar has been very useful for those who have listened to it. So thank you and goodbye.